Hello there, it's Sundip, and in this video, I'm going to take you through some of the um, basic ideas around the reversed Sicilian. And so this opening is uh, characterized by 1c4 followed by e5. And so c4 uh, is the fourth most popular opening in Lichess on the Lichess database. So e4 is played something like 230 million times. I think d4 is 114 million times. I think the Reti opening is the third most with 22 million, and c4 is something like 17 million times. And so c4 is just useful at all levels, but particularly at low level because it's a principled opening that challenges for the center from the flank. But black is at a lower level is unlikely to be prepared. Much of the preparation from your opponents will be going into d4 and e4, and so um, you can catch your opponents off guard, right? But a completely principled way for black to play is to play e5 in response to c4. Okay, and so grandmasters play that line, and it's called a reverse Sicilian because, just to recall, a normal Sicilian is e4 followed by c5, and so reverse Sicilian refers to c4 e5. So it's like the Sicilian but with the colors reversed. Now, people who like this from the perspective of white say this is something really nice to play because it's like the Sicilian but with a tempo up. Okay, but you'll see that there is fighting chances for both white and for black. Um, and so the aim of this video is to go through some of the basic ideas from David Cummings' book, The English, which is published by Everyman Chess, which I'll link to in the bottom. There's a lot of detail in that book. In this case, we're just going to go through some of the basic ideas around the reverse Sicilian. So c4, e5, and then what happens next. And we'll try to tell the story from the perspective of both white and black, and what are some of the ideas here. Um, and so e5 is like I said at the top, a principled response because e5 is saying, okay, you're making a claim for the center from the flank, but I'm going to make a claim for the center as well by putting a pawn in the center and taking some control over this d4 square, the f4 square, and also threatening to play e5 someday and gain some space. So in response to this, white um, typically goes with knight c3, and here um, black plays knight f6, followed by knight f3. And so ordinary development happens when black plays knight c6. But there are some strange moves that can happen, particularly at low level. So I'm about 1800 rapid on Lichess, so I see all kinds of things happening. Black can play something like e5, and so e5 um, it's difficult to hold on to this pawn. E5 is not, although it looks good, it might seem tempting from the perspective of black. It doesn't do much. So the accurate response to e5 is to play something like knight g5, and now you're threatening to take this pawn. And it's quite difficult to hold on to the material. We'll go through something called the Bellon Gambit in a second, which does that. And that has some advantages and disadvantages. But most of the time, your opponents won't know. So they'll play e5 not knowing much about it. And now, what can you do? Black can play something like queen e7, and you can go ahead and play queen c2. And now you have a triple attack on this pawn. Note that something like d5 doesn't hold on to the pawn because you can take, and after knight takes, this pawn is up for grabs. So e5 is not such a great move. Note in this position you can play something like the Bellon Gambit, which is then b5. And so here, black is effectively saying, well, you could take my pawn, but then I'll take your pawn, or you could have this as a free pawn. Now, you really don't want to take this pawn because after you take, black can go ahead and play something like d5. And so now this is very awkward. It's not losing for white, but it's very awkward for white to play. You've got these two monster pawns in the center. You've got this wayward pawn here for white on the side. So it's a bit difficult. So if black goes ahead and plays this Bellon Gambit, you can play something like d3, which is the accurate response. And now after you take, you can go ahead and take the b pawn. Black will try and kick this knight away, knight f3, take the pawn, bishop e2, and now material is equal, but white is quite active, right? White's bishops are coming out, not to that square, but some other square. The light square bishop is out, getting ready to castle. Queen is active. The knights are in the center, so it's a kind of pleasant position. So in this position, after c4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, and knight f3, e4 is not such a great idea, or it doesn't do much. Let's put it that way. The most principled way to play is to play something like knight c6. And so now both sides have done some basic development. The position is completely solid for both sides. And there are various ways in which the game can... The recommendation that David Cummings makes in his book is to play e3. And so e3 is at first a strange looking move, but makes a lot of sense. And what it's saying is that, okay, black has taken some control over the d4 square with this e5 pawn and this knight on c6. And white is reclaiming this square, right? Saying, okay, I've got a pawn here challenging for d4, and I've got this knight here that's challenging for it. And now white is also getting ready to play d4. And then the queen will also be supporting that pawn, right? And so here, black can do various things. Note, the e4 idea again doesn't work because now, after you play knight g5, it's actually not possible to play the Bellon Gambit because when you take, you have a tempo on this knight. And if you try to play something like queen e7, play queen c2, knight b4 is a try, you can come back to queen b1, and basically this pawn is falling. So e4 doesn't really work here either. The most principled thing to do is to try and develop this bishop. Okay, so you develop the bishop, and then black is effectively ready to castle. So this bishop can go in various places. Before I show you where it should go, it's worth going over where it shouldn't go, and which you will see a lot at the lower levels in Blitz and Rapid. And so one place, obviously, most of us understand it shouldn't go is to d6, right? Because then you blockade this pawn and you can't develop this bishop. Another place where it looks like it could go, but it doesn't really, is c5. Okay, bishop c5, although looks natural, does nothing, and in fact gives a lot of initiative to white. So you can actually go ahead and take this pawn. And now after the knight takes knight, you can fork the bishop and knight to win back the minor piece. And so the engine recommends bishop b4, but usually what I see players do is just take the pawn to get back their material. And after you take, the knight goes back to c6, or it goes to g5 to avoid a further tempo if d5 is played. And so bishop c5 doesn't do anything and gives white a pretty strong center. So just to recap, bishop c5. Bishop c5, knight takes pawn, knight takes knight, d4, fork, take, and now something like knight g5, and the position is very pleasant for white, and black just looks a bit awkward in this position. So bishop c5 doesn't really work. One way to play is to play something like bishop e7. Now, bishop e7 is a little bit passive, but bishop e7 is perfectly fine. It's getting ready to castle. And here white has various options. The author recommends something like queen b3 And so queen b3 is useful because it stops d5 from being played, because you have 3 guardians of this d5 square. And so it's a kind of positional move, gets the queen developed to an optimum square, and it's kind of an interesting line to choose. There are other ways to play here. You could just play d4, and now after e takes d, there are lines where both the knight takes and this pawn takes. And so now the game just goes on, right? So it's an ordinary game, and it's down to your chess. Bishop e7 is very playable. Perhaps the most testing line to play is something like bishop b4. The bishop b4 threatens to double this pawn structure around white's queen side, but also discourages the d4 push because the knight would be pinned, right? So now if you play something like d4, okay, it's not losing, but black could play the move e4, and now it's just a little bit annoying because the knight on f3 has to move. It's looking a bit cramped. The knight is taken away from its optimum square where it protects the king once it's eventually castled by protecting the h2 square. So bishop b4 is definitely testing. And so in response to that, the author talks about various things, but queen c2 is an idea that he recommends. And so queen c2 guards against the doubling of pawns, but also keeps an eye on this e4 square. It also has the long-term value of developing on this diagonal, which you'll see in a second poses some mating threats for black. Okay, and so after queen c2, black can take, and there are lines involving both b takes c3. Now you might ask, well, why would you do that when you've put your queen on c2? It can be sometimes useful to leave a pawn like this because it does guard this square and this square, and so it's very, very difficult for this knight to make an advance. There are lines where b takes c3 is played, and also the queen remains on this diagonal. But if the bishop takes, the author does recommend taking with the bishop, and now you're hitting this pawn twice, and so something like queen e7 is played and the game goes on. Okay, so in this position, black usually castles, right? And now comes some of the interesting stuff. So now the knight can develop to d5, which is a recommendation. And so knight d5 does various things. It puts some pressure on black. So it grabs this little outpost. Not really an outpost because this knight could eventually be kicked away. There is some pawn that could be pushed. There are sufficient material for black to trade this knight off. There's not really an outpost yet. But the knight is effectively on a strong square, can deliver a check, could take this bishop. It's a little bit annoying. Now the first thing here is that although the engine recommends taking the knight, it can be a little bit difficult to play. So after knight takes knight, pawn takes, you have to do something about this knight on c6, and that typically goes to e7. And so you could take this pawn, and after black takes this pawn, okay, the game is equal. But the line I play, because I face a lot of people who play knight takes knight in this position, the line I like to play is something like queen e4. So queen e4 just hits this bishop. And so now black plays a kind of awkward move like d6. And now the pawn really is up for grabs. And well, if you're black, do you really want to play this position? Okay, so your bishop is blockading this pawn. You have to do something about your light squared bishop. The queen controls absolutely nothing. This knight is awkwardly placed. The rooks are not connected. Okay, it's not an easy position to play. It's not losing, but it's just a little bit awkward. So in this position, after you castles knight d5, you can put a question mark next to knight takes knight. And I guess knight takes knight you see a lot because, in fact, how many times do you see knight takes knight? So in the lead chess database, the main move in this position is bishop c5, which is to try and protect the bishop. At a grandmaster level, it's actually rook e8, which is the main line, which we'll have a look at. So here, you don't really need to worry about the knight taking the bishop from black's perspective, because if you take, let's say if black follows the main line of rook e8, if you take, well, the knight recaptures and has a tempo on the queen has to move. If you try to hit the knight can protect itself, and the knight also eyes this square for a fork, which the queen has to keep an eye on. Okay, you could kick it away, but it's not really that effective. And so white is moving away from its outpost, taking the bishop, and it's not really clear what kind of compensation white is getting for that. And so the main line in this position after rook e8 is, it's worth saying that the purpose also of rook e8 is that if the bishop can continue to live, which it does in the main lines, it has the retreat square of f8. Okay, and one day it might come on to something like g7. So it's an escape square for the bishop. And that is useful because if white plays the move a3, for example, a mistake that I've seen is this. And now you're just losing material because after b4, the bishop has to go back. And before you play c5 to win the bishop, you first have to take this knight with check. Queen takes. And now you play c5 and win the bishop, and you're just winning, right? And so rook e8 also guards against the move rook e8 in this position. Ooh, let's go back. The move rook e8 in this position guards against this bishop being harassed because it has this escape square after a move like a3 is played. And so now the most testing line, or one of the testing lines around this, is queen f5. Now queen f5 it looks threatening. It does carry some threats, and the main line here is that black will play something like d6 to develop the bishop and also just hit this queen. Now here, white usually just takes the knight and it's check. And now black has two options. It can enter a queenless middle game with its pawns doubled, which might not be so dangerous, but it is kind of annoying to have those pawns doubled around the king. Or after knight takes knight, one of the lines played is just g takes f6, and now the queen moves to something like h5 because it was under attack. And okay, black isn't losing, but it's a difficult position to play, and this has been played at the grandmaster level. So in this position, after knight d5, rook e8, white has this juicy move of queen f5 to try and get some control and initiative in the game. Another interesting line here to think about is a line that I play, which is involves some cheap tricks, which can work, is the move knight g5. And so let's say black does something passive here. Let's say, I don't know, black just wastes a move and plays something like, well, actually, let's say black develops in another way. Let's say black plays d6 in this position. So d6 is now getting ready to move this bishop somewhere. Maybe f5, maybe e6. G4 doesn't do anything. There's no pin. And so in this position, knight g5 is a very, very interesting line. Because here, especially in a blitz or rapid game against lower rated players, there is a checkmate threat. There's only one good move here for black, and that's to play g6. If you don't play g6, you will lose the game. And so if you look in the lead chess database, g6 has been played 185 times. And and h6 has been played 13 times. And so h6 obviously loses to knight takes knight check, and after queen takes or the king moves, it's then of course checkmate, right? So h6 does absolutely nothing. And so that's a nice kind of cheap trick to try in a faster game against lower rated opponents who are not necessarily paying attention. It's something that I've pulled off a number of times as well. The knight g5 is an interesting line to play. But definitely in this position after rook e8, note here you can still play knight g5, but here you don't necessarily have a checkmate threat because let's say black wastes to move or just plays d6 after knight takes knight check, queen takes knight. You can go ahead and take this. This is not checkmate. No, the king comes here. You could play something like this. King moves here, and now the queen retreats to h4. And this is very unpleasant. It's again not losing according to the engine. But if you're black, do you really want to play this position? So the knight g5 lines are interesting because you can put a lot of pressure on your opponent. But if you want to play in a completely solid, principled way, queen f5 is quite testing for black. Okay, so what are some of the other responses here? So the engine here is actually saying go ahead and play g6 with a view of playing bishop g7. So in this position, if black is saying okay, I don't want to contest for the center, well, you just go ahead and take it. So now you play something like d4, and the game goes on. You can take, develop your bishops, castle, and the game is just continues. So one last move to consider in this position is something like d5. So if you're black and you just want to completely open the game up, you want it to be an open position. You don't want to play this kind of closed setups, play in a positional way. You just want to play a dynamic game with tactics and things. You can't just go ahead and play d5, right? D5 is not losing, but it's whenever my opponents play d5, it's always interesting because now after c takes d, knight takes pawn, bishop b5, knight takes knight, b takes c3, take towards the center, bishop d6, this pawn was hanging, play something like d4, which is what the author recommends, and now the game can veer off in many directions, but it's a little bit more open, right? Black has both the bishop pair, so does white. Black is ready to castle, white is ready to castle, and the game goes on. And so it's quite an interesting game. So yeah, what else? So to recap, we have c4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, knight c6, e3. We've seen that bishop e7 or trying to fianchetto and move to g7 are two options. A testing line is bishop b4 followed by queen c2, and of course bishop c5 we've seen with the fork doesn't work. After you take, you've got this fork. And curiously, that little mistake with bishop c5, which you see, which is very tempting, especially to people who like to play things like the London system, has been seen. Let's have a look. Has been seen something like bishop c5 has been seen 11,000 times. So the move bishop c5 in the Lee chess database, although a small mistake, has been seen 11,000 times, which is quite interesting. Okay, and so that concludes some of the main ideas around the Reversed Sicilian. I hope you enjoyed that, and please leave your feedback.